Welcome. Today we are going to address medieval Catholic asceticism and its treatment of the passions. Like their Eastern cousins, this is a mystical philosophy as well as practical. It's probably one, though, that is far more familiar to you, a Western audience, than the notions of Hesychism was, and there are some distinct differences between the two. Another title for mysticism in the West is experiential, or sometimes also identified as experimental. So, what do you think of when you hear experiential religion? Probably your first thought is experience, is doing things, right? You have to have the experience to know what you're talking about. But if it's experiential, as in experiments, then is this like a weird chemistry experiment, but with our brain chemistry? Or is it some sort of combination of the two, where you're having like guided meditation, and some of you might be thinking about these. Still others of you are probably thinking, didn't we just talk about this already? And the answer is a little bit. There's definitely some overlap between East and West, but the approaches are different, and they're different enough that it's worth us spending some time in the West as well as the East. As we addressed last section, mysticism is nothing new to Christianity. While it is often associated with the certain members of the church who took on a monastic life, it is no way unique to this handful select group of monastics. We shouldn't equate the term mystic and monastic, while we can equate the term mystic with experiential. Monastics are individuals who withdraw to be alone with God, or possibly with a small group of like-minded men or women who attempt to live together in a strict rule. That's what monasticism is. Not all monastics are mystics, nor are all mystics monastics. There exists an interesting trend within Christianity that anytime its message is accepted by a wider culture, a certain percentage of the population want a more ascetic life, and therefore will voluntarily remove themselves from this larger community and become what's commonly referred to as a monk or a nun. In part, they do this because they believe that life is too easy, and that true intimacy with God requires greater devotion, notions of penance, or isolation. And they find this in small cloistered groups as opposed to the broader world. While monastics seek to know God, mystics are those who encounter God in a transcendent manner. Many monastics are mystics, not all are, and there are also accounts of mystics who are definitely not monastics, as mentioned earlier. At the heart of both, though, mysticism and monasticism, is this desire to know God personally and to experience God's love and God's grace. For many Christians, the desire to experience God is more important than knowing God or understanding God. And there is a challenge when trying to understand these terms in this way. How this look differs depending on which branch of Christianity we're addressing. We already expressed how this expression lives out in orthodoxy with notions of Hesychism. In the West, we have different expressions found within Catholicism, and later different expressions still when addressing Protestantism. We're going to address the Catholic response today, and Protestant response to this when we address notions of pietism later on. So who are we going to address when turning our attention to medieval Catholic mysticism? The first person I'd like to draw our attention to is Angelina Da Feligna, 1248 to 1309. We're also going to spend a brief amount of time with Johann Tower, 1300 to 1361. You have his readings, which will expand upon what we discuss here in class. And finally, we're going to have our attention paid to Thomas à Kempis, 1380 to 1471. There are many, many more that we could address that are more famous than some of these three. We could talk about St. Francis Assisi, Marguerite de Poyet, Meister Eckhart, Gerhard Grota, Thomas More, Ignatius Loyola, Teresa of Avila, and the list goes on and on. There is no want for Catholic mystics, both those who are monastics and those who are not. So why did I pick the people that I did? There's three big reasons. One, I wanted to pick a group of people whose writings are influential in later mystics. So we can see some of the writings and thoughts of Feligna, Tower, and Kempis in the life and work of others. I also wanted to pick a group of people who were diverse enough from one another. I've got one who's an Italian, a German, and a Dutch. And again, there's a difference when we're looking at different regions of Western Europe for this. They are also, I've got different religious orders. We've got a Franciscan, a Dominican, and an Augustinian, although Kempis is not technically this. We also have the introduction of a woman as well as two men. I wanted people that were early enough also to be universally accepted by Western Christians. So if you happen to be Protestant, you're able to at least not have any animosity pointed towards these people. They're early enough that you will see some of their ideas in your literature. But I also wanted them to be late enough that they seemed modern and clearly Western as opposed to just other early examples of monasticism or mystics in that first period of Christianity known as the patristic period. So if I needed them to be before the Protestant Reformation, people like More has to go away, as well as Loyola and also Teresa of Avila. I also didn't want somebody who was charged with heresy, so Marguerite Porete, even though she was not a monk in French and has those going for her, but charged with heresy really kind of doesn't help, so she has to go away as well. And we will end up briefly addressing people like Francis and Meister Eckhart and Gerhard Grota and their impact and how they helped advance Feligno, Tower, and Kempis. So they get to go away, but are still kind of present. In any way, these are the three that I picked, Feligno, Tower, and Kempis. And their ideas will help transmit what we're hoping to understand very clearly. The first of these three that we will put our attention to is Angelina Da Feligna. The exact details of her birth are unknown, but she was likely born in 1248 in the Italian region of Umbria in the town of Feligno, therefore Angela from Feligna, right? Her father died when she was young, and according to Angela, her mother loved the pleasures that the city had to offer. This wealthy small town had many pleasures for the 13th century and was more exciting than one might think initially. Angela's mother encouraged her to indulge in the hedonistic fruit that the city had offered. Honoring her mother's request, Angelina fell into sin and led a disorderly life, according to her writings later. At 20, she married a wealthy man and bore him at least 2 sons. As a wife and mother, Angela did not stop loving the disorderly life that she was accustomed to. Some local accounts go as far as claiming that she was unfaithful to her husband. We have no clear evidence of this, by the way, but Angela's own discussion of her pre-conversion sin suggests that it was sexual in nature. Still, no real confirmation exists, and she never explicitly states that she was disloyal to her husband, at least after marriage. In Angelina's 30s, the city of Feligno went under some devastating changes that resulted in her doing the same. There was a violent earthquake that tore through the valley in 1279, and a hurricane then followed. War also then broke out against Perugia, and this external chaos really only served to highlight Angela's own internal chaos. The weight of her own emptiness crushed her. The comforts of this world failed to fill her void. Little by little, Angela became aware of her own sins, leading to her conversion in 1285. One fateful night in 1285, Angela called out to St. Francis of Assisi a fairly new canonized saint, and asked him to find her a confessor. That night she had a vision of Francis, who told her, "Sister, if you would have asked me sooner, I would have complied to your request sooner. Nonetheless, your request is granted." She then went to confession and laid out her sins with a profound fear of hell and the consequences of her sinful life. According to Pope Benedict XVI, this was the real beginning of her mystical journey. Quote, "The long journey that led from her starting point, the great fear of hell, to her goal of total union with the Trinity." Angelina continued to go to confession and longed for a monastic life, but the obligations she had as a wife and as a mother excluded this opportunity for the next 3 years. In 1288, within a space of a handful of months, Angelina was freed from these obligations, as her mother's death was followed by the death of her husband and the death of her children. With nary a moment to waste, she sold all of her possessions and made preparation to join the Franciscan order, which she did in 1291. In a rather dramatic fashion, echoing the conversion of St. Francis, Angelina went to church and stood before the crucifix, stripped herself naked, and pledged herself to Christ. Following this, she sold nearly all of her property and clothing and gave them all to the poor. Now, it's important to note that when St. Francis did this, he was renouncing not only possessions, but also his family's trade. He was giving up the future that his family was going to provide for him, selling textiles, etc. When Angelina is doing this, she's giving up everything, not only possible future economic success, but she's saying, "I'm dedicating myself to the rule, to the order that St. Francis of Assisi has dictated, and I'm going to follow this with my life." Angelina will produce one major work in her life, simply known as her book, Il Libro. There are 2 parts to this. The first is known as the Memorial, and the second as the Instructions. The Memorial began as Angelina's confession. Angelina's confessor brought a few sheets of paper to record her confession following her conversion, as was kind of normal to do. And Angelina promptly responded that he needed to bring a notebook for her sins and not simply a few pages of paper. The memorial was dedicated to her confessor and covered her spiritual journey from 1285 to 1297. The memorial consists of 30 steps or stages along her spiritual transformation. Many of these steps actually repeat an earlier step, but advance it to a greater degree. For instance, we're able to see of the first few steps, awareness of sins is found in step 1, 6, and 8. Similarly, notions of penance are brought to focus in steps 3 and 11, and a desire to be poor is found in steps 9, and expanded upon when she stripped her clothes and renounced all of her possessions, showing her actually being poor in steps 12 and 20. Again, these are very repetitive compared to other works that are talking about the same basic issue, but this is her life, and many of us don't just decide one thing at one time. We go through them over and over and over again until we master it and then kind of master it a little bit more. This is a spiritual autobiography, and these repetitive steps are understandable in that way. This is not a guide to holiness for future monks or nuns, like St. John of the Ladder wrote with his 30 steps. These are Angela's personal 30 steps to intimacy with God. What is striking is not the common themes that we should expect, such as sin, confession, guilt, absolution, and the awareness of God, but the depth that occurs in these steps and the fluidity between the spiritual world and the material world. In many accounts, Angelina depicts herself standing in front of a crucifix. She is then no longer in front of a crucifix, but rather standing before the living crucified Christ, who points out his wounds to her. In another place, Angelina recounts her discussions with St. John and with the Virgin Mary, and she echoes the pain that they felt during Christ's Passion. She also tells of her further insight into her sins and the redemption found in Christ due to the intercessions of Mary. Throughout the work, Angelina seeks to identify herself with Mary and with Christ, and maintains that experiencing Jesus includes undergoing what he experienced himself. Let's turn our attention a little bit more to these 3 steps that we had laid out earlier. First, that issue of awareness of sins. To master our passions, we first need to be aware of where our faults lie. We already addressed this idea of a positive comparison with others and the need for a guide and confession within Asceticism, but we're going to see a similar idea here, where you need to find a way to become aware of what you need to work on. Turning our attention to the idea of penance, an idea that is not really found within Asceticism. Penance is something that is more important in the West than it is in the East. There is the idea that your sins, while covered, still need to be paid for, that you have an obligation. Right? You must find a way to right your relationships with those who are around you. You need to do certain acts when you have erred against other people. This is a central idea within Western Christianity, that simple contrition is not sufficient. You should ask yourself, what benefits are there from doing penitential acts, from doing things for others? If you have wronged somebody, don't you think that you should do something for them instead of simply saying, yeah, sorry about that? That there needs to be some act of restitution and some attempt made in your life in fixing this? By doing this, we can help others, and this work reminds us of ourselves that we also need mercy and should offer that to those who have wronged us. Again, this is similar to the argument that's being made by St. John of the Ladder, that we should not hold a record of wrongs while asking Christ for mercy. But instead of simply being done in prayer or in word, penance asks you to do this in deed as well. And many of us might accept the idea of awareness of sins and penance fairly easily. It's that third one that's causing us issue, this desire to be poor, because most of us see poverty as something to be avoided. So how do we desire to be poor? There are, by the way, historical reasons for this. Before the Reformation, it was taken seriously that the poor will inherit heaven. That poverty was close to godliness. This only changed really in the Western mindset with Calvinism, and we'll address this later on. But what else have we seen? A lot of the times we see that possessions can harm us. We have this idea found within hedonism, Buddhism, and clearly Cynicism as well, that the more you take on is going to make your life less full, that there's value in simplicity. Again, we're not saying starvation, that's another step, but poverty of just enough. In fact, maybe even not always just enough is what's being advocated here. We have that question that we've asked before. At what point do our possessions own you? And even if you're not renouncing the world, the idea that you should have less stuff is probably something you can accept. A desire to be poor also has some practical benefits in your life. Are any of you familiar with the Peter Principle? The Peter Principle says that you rise to the level of your incompetence. This is a principle that applies in business. You're really good at one job and you get promoted to the next job, and you get promoted to the next job, and you continue to get promoted because you've done very well at the job that you had. until you find yourself now at a job that you can't do. You're not properly equipped for, and you fall and you are now incompetent at it. This is something that a lot of businesses have to keep in mind, and is something that you probably should also think about in your own life. Many of us, with our desire for more, will accept eagerly a promotion. Yes, give me more, give me more, give me more. And what happens? More responsibility. More money, usually. And this is the reason why you're doing it, but not even always more money. Sometimes it's just a nicer title or a nicer office or something along those lines. But how would your life be if you said no to some of these promotions? If you stopped and you weighed them carefully and said, you know what? I'm actually really good at my job. I don't want a promotion. That extra stress, that extra work, that extra obligations, the extra hours I'm going to have to spend at work, I don't want to do it. No, thank you. Even if you're suited for it, even if you do well, even if you know that that promotion is something that you would do, is it as enjoyable as the current position that you have? Is it going to be the life that you really want? Sometimes not. We need this desire to be poor, as Angelina is pointing out. We need this idea of saying no to getting more. Instead of just this constant lust for more, this greed, this avarice, this just taking everything. There's value in saying, no, you know what? My life's going really good right now. I don't want to mess that up. Angelina ends up giving us 3 keys to success in her mysticism. These are somewhat connected with what we've already addressed: poverty, contempt, and sorrow. You can stop and ask yourselves a little bit, what benefits do we have in overcoming our passions if we internalize the ideas of poverty, contempt, and sorrow? She declared that through temporal poverty, the soul will find eternal riches. That if we want to be truly wealthy, that we shouldn't look for fulfillment in this world, or at least with what you're going to get next. Maybe find it in something else of this world. For those of you who are not going to be monastics like Angelina, maybe with friends and family, maybe with relationships with other people, but not just with wealth. The next thing she advocates is the argument that through contempt and shame, we will obtain supreme honor and very great glory. Shame is not something that our culture currently prizes. In fact, if we feel shamed, we tell people to stop shaming us for whatever the reason happens to be. But she says you want to accept shame, and that this is an issue of honor and can bring you glory. If you're doing something wrong, listen to other people when they're trying to shame you and say, you know what, you're right. That is something I should work on, if it is indeed something that you should work on. And what's that going to do? That's probably going to bring benefits to that relationship. And she says, through a little penance made with pain and sorrow, it will possess the infinite sweetness of consolation, the supreme good, the eternal God. By doing acts of penance, we are going to show our sorrow, and this will bring us to great goodness in our life. Again, the notion of poverty is central to her arguments. Contempt is a natural outcome of being aware of our sins. We want to not do it anymore. We will not make excuse for the wrongs that we have done, but we will learn to despise them. And hopefully this will be in a positive and uplifting way for your life. And sorrow is expressed in penance, according to Angelina. Again, sorrow that is sweet and consoled. It's not a self-loathing, a self-flagellating. You're not beating yourself or anything else like that, but a sorrow over the fact that you have wronged your beloved. In the instructions, following the completion of her first half of her book, her confessor died, and therefore we naturally have a second sort of work attached within her book. The point of the second half of the work was to lay out instructions for those sisters who gathered around Angela and joined themselves to her and the Franciscan order. In large measure, the instructions continue the rest of her biography while focusing on the same themes found in the memorial. Central to her mysticism is this love affair that she has with the suffering God-man, with Christ, as she calls him. Angela's mysticism also had an affirmation of her femininity. By connecting the body of Christ and Angela's own body through the Eucharist, Angela mentions that she is remade. The product of this mystical union is a marriage and a model for women who often felt shame over their bodies, which was characterized as being defiled or impure during the Middle Ages in Italy and elsewhere. Angela's body was united to Christ, just as her heart was. Therefore, it can't be defiled as it's connected with this suffering God-man. Writing to her followers, she states, "My son, if you were to see my heart, you would be absolutely obliged to do everything God wants, because my heart is God's heart, and God's heart is in mine." Notice here that her instructions are made over this theme of love. We have this mystical marriage that's taking place between Angela and Christ. What do you expect to give the person that you marry? What belongs only to you in this relationship? What belongs to them? Notice that this marriage is that of equals. My heart is God's heart, and God's heart is mine. There's a sharing. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. This is not subjugation, even though the person now she's wedded to is her Lord. How does your love for others make you want to treat them? What can we take from this notions of loving others when addressing the passion's role in our lives? Again, we can see the idea that the passions can be used for good, not just evil, as wrapped up with the idea of loving others is placing what they want first. And we should also notice and highlight this intimacy is associated with the Eucharistic practice. The Eucharist makes her body into this temple of God, takes away what anyone would want to say otherwise about defilement or impure, because it's now purified by the presence of God, which is a very radical feminine argument at this time. And there's been several articles written about this and the Eucharistic practice and its advancing of women's rights throughout the Middle Ages. And Angelina is right there amongst it, advocating for this because of her love affair with Christ. Now, one may expect that upon her death that we would have had a very large following gathering around Angelina Da Feligna. Instead, the attention for her life and her book slowly dwindled away. It took over a century before any attention was paid to her legacy, and it didn't grow in Italy. It actually grew in Belgium. It then grew all the more in the 15th century, and her book was then translated into Spanish, French, and to German. Her memorial and instructions greatly influenced the piety of other women, such as Teresa of Avila, as well as the piety of Ignatius of Loyola. St. Francis de Sales refers to Angela as one of those few superior women who are easier to admire than to imitate. Her influence is evident in both Catholics and Protestants before and after the Reformation. But it wasn't until fairly recently that she was actually canonized as a saint, and this was done by Pope Francis. Gerhard Grote lived a life fairly similar to those early days of Angelina Da Feligna. He was not in Italy, but 14th century Netherlands. He lived the life of a Renaissance man, a prominent businessman who was interested in worldly pursuits and indulging in everything that life had to offer. But he felt ill at one moment and believed he was going to die. Called the priest in to do last rites, and the priest refused to give him communion. The priest believed that Grote enjoyed his sin too much, and therefore giving him communion would only be leading him to damnation. This had tremendous effect on Grote. He recovered from his illness, didn't die right then, and turned his life around. He saw this as a monumental event that needed to be overcome. He gave his house over to poor women and went to a monastery, but while there decided he wasn't going to become a monk. He did become ordained a deacon, though, and he was a preacher who then wandered around telling people to repent, to follow his example. He'll actually begin a modern devotional movement in 1374. This group is known as the Brethren and Sistren of the Common Life, sometimes just referred to as Brethren. And this group had women and would not all be monastics in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a mixture of lay and ordained piety, which sought education as the means of growing in the faith. Grote really saw education as lacking in medieval Europe and decided that he wanted to have a more educated clergy and would set up schools to help advance this. Grote is one of those founding members of what's called the Northern Renaissance, where new learning and attention is turned and allows for study and understanding of the world around them. But this is connected to notions of piety. The Brethren of Common Life have a few other famous members, one of which is Thomas à Kempis, who we will get to later, but we'll also see Erasmus coming out of these schools as well. Thomas à Kempis is arguably the most significant member of the Brethren of the Common Life. Arguably, because Erasmus is usually put up in that same sort of category. But his work is really what's important about à Kempis. It wasn't so much his life or the impact that he had in anything else, but his one work, The Imitation of Christ, is one of the most widely read books in the Western world. And it is, next to the Bible, the most widely translated book in Christian literature. What do we know about the life of Thomas à Kempis the man? We know enough. Actually, we have a lot more details about his life, but it's really not that remarkable. Most descriptions of his life paint him as a pious but otherwise fairly unremarkable fellow. Physically, he was of average height, had dark complexion, had a broad forehead. It said he had piercing eyes. In fact, those eyes were likely the most expressive part of him, because otherwise he was pretty silent and shy. Some will describe him as the most placid and uneventful of all men who ever wrote a book or scribbled letters. And while this seems a little bit harsh, it seems a little bit accurate. In fact, his life is so placid that a lot of people will even say that he didn't write The Imitation of Christ because this guy, really? Him? Hasn't done anything. Doesn't seem like he would have done this. But again, he was pious, and almost everybody agrees that indeed he is the author of The Imitation of Christ. Since little can be said about his life, or at least little that's going to advance our discussion of the passions. And all of his life's significance, as it were, was laid out in the Imitation of Christ. Let us turn our attention to the Imitation. In the Imitation, A Kempis lays out a few meditative issues for the Christian. On the very outset is a critique of learning over piety. He says, indeed, it is what good is knowledge without fear, holy and just, but a virtuous life makes him pleasing to God. Other invectives, such as a man is raised up from the earth by two wings, simplicity and purity. There must be simplicity in his intention and purity in his desires. Simplicity leads to God. Purity embraces and enjoys him. These place him in line with Tower and Feligna, who emphasize poverty, and a notion found within A Kempis, but nowhere to the same degree as in the others. Far more of the work is focused on other practices of piety, urging men to overcome their sinful life when he tells them to fight like a man. Habit is overcome by habit. Create good habits to eliminate those bad things in your life. Much like Aristotle, the idea is to acquire virtues by creating good habits. Doing the things that you know will help you overcome your passions that exist in this world. Habits are powerful, not easy to break or to start, as we have addressed before. But what do you do when you want to break one habit? What's the best way of ending one habit? Generally, it's to start a new one. You're going to take on a new habit that's going to take the place of that old one. How many smokers, for instance, start chewing gum or having suckers or a carrot stick or something along these lines, right? They're taking this bad habit and replacing the same action, the same oral fixation with a new habit that is easier to incorporate, to swap it out, and is healthier. Depends on how many suckers, I guess, one has, but, healthier. The new habit, he said, should take the place of vice. And the new habit that we should take on is the cross, is prayer. Kempis argues, behold, the cross is everything, and upon your dying on the cross, everything depends. There is no other way to life and to true inward peace than the way of the Holy Cross and daily mortification. Kempis doesn't really view the cross as a choice, though, maintaining that no matter where you go, you cannot escape it, that the cross will change everything about how you live, and it is coming for us all. The choice is to carry the cross willingly, or it'll become burdensome upon you. Like Marcus Aurelius said in his meditation, in connection with the ethics of Stoicism, that you're tied to this cart. Your choice is only to run with it or to get dragged behind. Instead of a cart, what's before all of us, Kempis says, is this cross. You can choose to fight against it, fight against God's love, or you can embrace it, but you cannot avoid it. Choosing the cross rather than fighting against it reveals God's love, which is the predominant theme of the first half of Book 3 in the Imitation. Kempis is constantly speaking of God as the fountain of unceasing love, and his most beloved spouse, and his holy lover. And this is connected to the sacrament of communion, which is the theme of the final book. Communion is transformative, as it was for Angelina Da Feligna. It is the same for Kempis. Throughout this concluding section, Kempis marvels at the power and presence of God and the neglect found by so many Christians. He says here that the mystery of the presence of God has a real potential of becoming routine for Christians, including priests, who may forget that they are communing with God. This disconnected piety, he says, is demonstrated with the difference between people traveling to honor relics of saints. says, marveling at their wonderful deeds and at the buildings of these magnificent shrines, while not noticing that in the sacrament of the altar you are wholly present, my God, the man Christ Jesus, whence is obtained the full realization of eternal salvation, as often as you are worthy and devoutly received. Notice that Kempis marvels at this misplaced energies that many of us will have. We're going to do something big and grandiose when what we need might be right in front of us and easier to get. Then we need to be grateful for the things that we have and that the things that are easily given to us. In fact, the term Eucharist means thanksgiving. So even if you don't adopt the theistic ideas that Kempis is arguing for, you can still take this idea. We can look at the things that we have to be grateful for, the things that are near at hand instead of those that are far away. How many of you will regularly and routinely stop and count your blessings? Think about what you have to be grateful for. You should do this daily, if not more. Have a period of time where you stop and say, you know what? I'm thankful I had this today or this week. And are actually grateful for something. Count your blessings. Literally stop and count them. Many of us have a very easy time complaining and grumbling about life. This went wrong, this isn't going right, these people don't like me, I have this obstacle, this struggle. But what difference would it make to your life if you were to stop and instead of just grumbling about things, and I'm not saying not to grumble, the Kempis might, but we all have our own issues. Right? But we're to stop and actually say, I'm thankful for this. That regardless of what crap happened today, what mess I had to deal with, I'm going to be thankful that this happened. If this was a regular habit in your life, how would this change the way that you look at your life? How much more would you enjoy your life? And oddly enough, create a new habit instead of that old habit. That old habit of complaining at the end of your day turns into one of at least stopping and being thankful for one thing. Notice again that we're to be thankful for what's given to us. Right? Not for things that are far away that require effort, but for what's right there at hand. That doesn't require great effort. For Kempis, communion is this extremely powerful thing. He says, for First Communion fulfills the spiritual desire for unity with God, a union that is nothing short of life itself. Without you, I cannot exist. Without your visitation, I cannot live. Communion becomes transformative, and this is the value that it has for us. Being grateful is something that's transformative. The Eucharist, the Thanksgiving, transforms and changes your life. A simple thing that's at hand and doesn't require great effort, but will change your entire life. Turning our attention now to the issues of the passions, according to Kempis, he wants to start off in Book 1, Chapter 3, by saying, happy is he to whom truth manifests itself, not in signs and words that fade, but as it actually is. O God, you are the truth. Make me one with you in love everlasting. What we notice here is that for Kempis, truth is a person. And, like we addressed within Buddhism and Stoicism, and Socrates and Gregory of Palamas, ignorance and false views can lead us to ruin. So the first thing we need to do is ground ourselves in what is true. In Chapter 4, he tells us that we shouldn't yield to every temptation, but rather carefully consider what our options are. Again, as we've addressed before you act, stop and think. Is this a good thing or not? An idea that you probably are already familiar with. He also encourages you to take counsel with wise and conscientious people. If you know somebody's around you who's more knowledgeable about a subject, go saddle up next to them. Try to learn from them. Don't just think you can do everything on your own, but take counsel, take the advice of others. In chapter 6, we read that when a man desires a thing too much, he at once becomes ill at ease. A proud and avaricious man never rests, whereas he who is poor and humble of heart lives in a world of peace. How many of your problems happen in life because you want too much? Once again, we can return to this discussion we had with Angelina Da Feligna of this desire to be poor. This checking our desires, our impulses. Instead of wanting more and more, there's times that we need to stop and say, I'm fine with less. What we want is true peace. And true peace, he says, of heart, is found in resisting these passions and not in satisfying them. There's no peace in the carnal man and the man given to vain attractions, but there is peace in the fervent and spiritual man. Being able to say no to some of those desires, even the good desires, even the things that you might want, might have some greater benefit than simply saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. In chapter 8, he says, don't open your heart to every man, but discuss your affairs with one who is wise and who fears God. Don't keep company with young people and strangers. Do not fawn upon the rich, and do not be fond of mingling with the great. Like we found within our discussion of Stoicism, fame is something that we put onto others. It's not permanent and doesn't satisfy the soul. Instead of placing fame upon anyone, find it in those who are wise and those people you'd like to emulate. Attach yourself to them and make them the objects of your veneration. Furthermore, he will tell us that we should shun the gossip of men as much as possible, right? Don't run out for idle talk. He says that this is a root of vanity which will bring you down. In chapter 13, he says that many people try to escape the temptations only to fall more deeply, that we cannot conquer simply by fleeing, but by patience and true humility we become stronger than all of our enemies. The man who only shuns temptations outwardly and does not uproot them will make little progress. Indeed, they will quickly return more violent than before. We need to find the root of our temptations and get rid of those. We can't simply pretend they're not there, but little by little, we need to have patience and long suffering, and that's going to help us to overcome these temptations in our life, these passions. Why is it that you are angry in this respect? Is there a root to this anger? Is there a root to the gossip, to the desire that you know is based in something? Stop and reflect, and again, take counsel with wise people and learn from them. This is the way to do it. And again, for Feligna, we see in Book 4, Chapter 3, the solution for most of this is, again, notions of communion. It says, my soul longs for your body, and my heart desires to be united with you. Give me yourself, it is enough. For without there is no consolation. Without you I cannot exist. Without your visitation I cannot live. I must often come to you, therefore, and receive the strength of my salvation, lest deprived of this heavenly food I grow weak on the way. Know what strengthens you. Go back to what strengthens and encourages you regularly. Whatever that happens to be, you know something's going to help you along that way. If it's a person, if it's a religious act, do that regularly to help you overcome the passions in your life. While Kempis's work, The Imitation of Christ, is the most prolific and impactful of these mystics that we're talking about, probably the mystic who's got the greatest fame and notoriety is Johann Tower. He was largely immune, by the way, to those claims of heresy that kind of dogged his teacher, Meister Eckhart. And his impact is greater than his fellow pupil of Eckhart's, Henry Suso. Unlike many of the other mystics, including Feligna, there was never a period where Tower was unknown. During his own lifetime, his works were read widely and widely disseminated throughout all of Europe. Later, Tower was read by both Lutherans and Jesuits. In the 19th century, the mystical German language of Tower drew Schlegel and the Romantics to his work, and it has a great impact in German Romanticism. Tower grew up in a pious and well-to-do home. His father, Nicholas, donated large portions of his wealth to the church, and two of his children, Johann and one of his sisters, became Dominicans. Johann became a novice at the age of 14, primarily due to his affinity towards the asceticism of the mendicant order. Tower is a part of a school of thought that is known as the Rhenish mystics. These are largely German, largely Dominican, largely mystics who want to experience a little bit more about God instead of just understanding God. In many ways, they are the counterweight to the sort of scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas, who, oddly enough, was a mystic himself. But Aquinas is one of the students of Albert the Great. The other is Meister Eckhart, both of which will run into different difficulties, both of which are Dominican, and both of which learn principles of Aristotle, as well as mystical theology of St. Dionysius and other ideas from Albert the Great. Albert will be one of those founding members of the University of Cologne, and many of the Rhenish mystics will go through this school, including Eckhart, and briefly even Aquinas will be a part of that. Tower and his fellow pupil Suso will learn from Eckhart. And all of them will focus on a life of inner devotion and intense prayer. And this is the way that Tower understands on how we should overcome the passions. Tower was a hesitant mystic. He engages in the mysticism, but doesn't really express a lot of that in his formal writings. He wants to be a good Catholic and not run into some of those troubles that he's seeing his teacher Eckhart run into. Most of his time and energy was spent in preaching, and most of his time preaching was to Dominican nuns. And so this is where we're going to see his messages on the passions addressed. It should come as little surprise that Tower, speaking to other mendicants, really emphasized the notion of poverty, that he would say that poverty is a likeness to God. Tower argues that poverty grants freedom, as the material things of this world cause attachments, and they serve to isolate you from God and from your neighbor. This notion has a lot of similarities with Buddhism and hedonism, that you need to limit your attachments to be happy, but the point for Tower is not a happy life, but a life connected with God. Like other Catholic mendicants, the goal is always this mystical union with God and not simply being happy. So we have to ask you, what is your goal? What is it you want in your life? If you want freedom to be able to achieve this goal, what are the things in your life that hinder you from reaching this goal? Why do you hold on to them? Why do you maintain them? Why is it that they are more important than the actual goal itself? We need to ask ourselves, or at least Tower is asking us to ask ourselves, to keep your eyes on the prize and get rid of every other attachment that isn't serving your ultimate goal. While Tower asks his followers to be poor, to abandon things that don't help in their goals, he also has a larger conception of what it is to be man. He argues for a twofold nature that exists in all of us. This notion is connected with Aquinas' doctrine of the visio essentia Dei, or the contemplation of the divine nature. This is why we will abandon all things to find freedom and perfection in Christ. That true poverty consists in abandoning all of these things of this world, and not only wealth. That we are created for things that are greater than all of our earthly attachments. He goes farther than his Dominican counterpart and holds that divine knowledge is attainable in this world due to the indwelling of God in each man. Tower explains that man is created for time and for eternity, for time in his body and for eternity according to his spirit. The body is made for the earth and seeks the things of this world, and the spirit is made to seek God. And this twofold nature is where we have to wrestle with what we have and make sure that we're doing what we want. Ultimately, Tower says that the spirit will prevail when man is touched by God and reveals himself as a light unlike any other. This notion of the transfiguration that we talked about with Polemos does have some overlap here with Tower. And this is the closest thing that we actually see about Tower revealing his own experience as a mystic, when he states that when God reveals himself to your soul, that this is without all doubt, and man cannot doubt it. Have you ever had any experiences that changed your life? An experience that recontextualizes everything that you've done before and will shape all or most of what you will do from that point forward? In many ways, this is what we're addressing with Tower. The idea that there's a life-changing event, that there's this duality between what is routine of what we go through before and what exists in those moments afterwards and the insights that we gain from this. While Tower is specifically addressing a spiritual life with God, we can see a division between the inner man and the outer man in a few different ways. What are the desires that you have versus the routines that you find yourselves in? What are those special insights as opposed to normal life? When Tower is addressing the inner man, he sees this as the entirety of man. The body is made subject to the soul, and he sees this as the way that you're intended to be. Your body should serve the goals that you have. It's a part of you, but it's subservient to what you need and want. To do this, you need to look inside yourselves, he says, at the divine spirit common to all, claiming, "O dear children, turn your eyes inwardly, where this birth must really be born, which will cause great joy throughout all of Christendom." Again, we have the idea that self-reflection is key to the notions of transformation. This process he likens to a couple other things, including the consecration of the church, the episcopacy, the high priest being namely that of Christ, and the priests who take on this role, and of course the value that we see in the life of the Virgin Mary. We have to ask ourselves about our own transformation, about when we move from one place to another. Have you ever taken a trip, gone on a long road trip, vacation? What did you bring? What did you take with you? Did you take everything that you owned? Probably not. You only took what you needed, that which served the goal. You realize sometimes while you're on this trip that you don't need everything that you thought you needed, that you have a lot of attachments that are not essential. And so this is the same thing. We need to look at these events in our lives, these transformative things, this changing of one substance to another, the church that is a building to now a place where holy services are done, the Virgin Mary who was transformed from a girl, a young woman, to the Mother of God, the high priest who's now ordained and given this authority to administer sacraments. On your trips, you realize that certain things before aren't necessary and you can leave them behind. That we need to find ways of limiting ourselves, limiting those extraneous things, life, experience, even some people that we're wanting, that we don't need to take with us on our daily lives. How many of your own experiences are you carrying with you after you're wanting to be transformed into something new? Do you take your hurt, your pain, your remembrance of wrongs and misplaced affections? Limit these, get rid of them, shun them, run away from them. Be this transformation that you're seeking after and desiring to be. Tauler retells a fairly popular, well-known story, the story of Zacchaeus, and he connects this to the idea of consecration, not of buildings, but of the life that you have. He says of Zacchaeus that he wanted to see the Lord, but of course he was too little of stature. So what did he do? Really, it's important for Tauler that he's asking, what did Zacchaeus actually do? Not what was his intention. In fact, there's a large debate on the role of intentionality. But what is it you actually do? What is it that you do in your own life when you want something but are limited by forces either inside or outside of yourself? If you're too short to see over a crowd, your options are either to miss out or to get to higher ground, to find a vantage where you get to see what it is that you want to see. Zacchaeus climbs a barren fig tree. According to Tauler, this is what a devout man does who desires to see God. But if he's too short and too small, what must he do? Tauler says he must climb up into the high and barren fig tree. And that is what is written for all of us. It is a constant dying to the outward parts of man's nature and living wholly in the inner man in which God, the Lord, walks, as you have already heard. You need to run to the inner man. You need to run to those things that matter to you, those moments which transform you. You need to find ways around the obstacles in your life, to push those aside and strive after what's worth striving for. And then what's the response that Tauler gives for Zacchaeus? The Lord says to him, make haste, hurry up, come down. Come down and be with me, for I'm going to go to your house today. Right? In fact, Tauler's reading of this is a little bit different. He says, right, that you may keep nothing, but you're going to again return empty and bare to your own nothingness, which is an odd sort of way of phrasing the same thing. But what do you want? You want truth. You want connection. You want intimacy with things that matter, with people that matter. Well, what do you need to do? You need to cleave to this, to be willing to throw away all extraneous activities, people, things that aren't worth keeping, and strive after this. This is what Tauler urges us to do. He then continues, therefore learn that whatever nature always has some flaws, and is therefore not quite perfect and pure, so that human nature in the man, in the tree, cries to God. This is absolute self-surrender and a constant casting off of nature and all the ways in which man still clings to some possession of self. When you see something of great importance, everything else is a distraction. When you see what you really need and really want for your life, Everything else along that way is a distraction that needs to be thrown away. You need to abandon all of those constraints to get what you actually need. Even what is reasonable or comfortable, Tower points out. That you might be mocked, you might be insulted. It's fine. Those don't matter. The slings and arrows of those around you don't matter if they're keeping you from what you truly need. This is what you have to do when your passions hinder your life. Instead of aiding them, instead of giving in to your passions, you need to cast them off and become single-minded, have a purpose and a goal that's worth living for. This is why we need to realize what we need to take with us. We need to know what needs to go away, because those are the things you cast off first. The things that don't benefit your life, Tower here pointing to those passions, are the things that you need to get rid of. You need to have this devotion to what it is that you want. That's the point of Zacchaeus' story when Tower is telling it. So this is what we need to do, following the examples of Tower, Feligna, and Akempis. We want to experience the things that matter. For them, it was all the divine, the really real, the things that are more important than everything else. But you need to experience some other things in your life. Maybe it's these, and some other things. But how is it your life is going to have richer experiences that are worth having? You need to start with periods of time where you express gratitude or thanksgiving for what you have. That you need to seek a transformation, maybe a single-minded devotion where you're giving up on everything else, or smaller transformations with individual things. You might need to do something for somebody else that you've wronged. You might need to express that this transformation is taking root by doing acts of penance. And you should probably use the next few minutes to actually think about these. What about your life is worth having gratitude over? What is it that you can truly be thankful for? What transformative moments are you looking for in your life, or that you have had in your life that things need to go back to? That you need to ground yourself in that experience and perceive your life through looking at that experience. Or maybe you need to think about those that you have wronged. Maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but it's there. And you know you're not going to be at peace with everybody if that's there. So instead of casting that off and just ignoring it, maybe bringing that back and saying, all right, I need to do something for this person. Maybe I never even said I was sorry. Maybe I need to start there. But then, hey, let me try to live a little bit of life next to this person and help them out along the way. We're called, within this medieval Catholic ascetical practice, to experience life in a deeper way, and that these are some basic ways of accomplishing that. So what has this religious system told us about what is a religion? How does the work and life of Feligna, Tower, and Akempis help to tell us what is a good life? One of the things they were advocating for was poverty and elimination of a lot of what you have. Is that what a good life looks like? Maybe. How have they addressed what the passions are? What draws us away from that good life? And how to overcome those passions? Usually, for most of them, it was just a point or two. Feligna had 3, Tower had 2 major ones. Akempis had a few more throughout his discussions. But why should we overcome the passions? What's the purpose of that? And what has this system told us to that end? What qualities of an ethical system does this religion contain? Is it essentially an ethical system, or does it not have any discussion on ethics? Is it purely a religious system? After all, they were talking about the Eucharist and union with God. When we're talking about mysticism, it's hard to boil it down to only an ethical system. But what parts does it have? What parts does it lack? And how can we use this system today in answering the questions that you have, the struggles that you face and exist all around you? What can you borrow from and learn and adapt to fit your particular life? This is kind of the question of what we're trying to do with this, isn't it? Will it help you address these ethical debates that are new and show up today and disappear tomorrow? How do you want to address those, and how do you move forward with them?